Hello, welcome to ICOR's October webinar on risk culture and operational resilience. Risk culture really refers to the mindset and behavioral norms that determine how an organization identifies and manages risk. A healthy risk culture is more important than ever in a post-pandemic world. Long term, a healthy risk culture is a critical element of resilience against risk itself. A healthy risk culture is also an enabler of a more dynamic and flexible risk management. We're going to explore how to set up an effective risk culture program and how to build a more dynamic and flexible approach to managing risk and increasing operational resilience. My name is Linda Nelson, and I am the ICOR president, and I will be your speaker today. Let's look at some of our webinar logistics. Just like usual, the recording of the webinar will be available on the ICOR webpage in 2 days. If you have questions, use the questions button. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation. And if we don't have time, it'll be in an email after the webinar, but we should have time today. And attendees will receive a certificate of attendance if you attend a minimum of 35 minutes. Our objective here today, our overall purpose, is to understand risk culture and how it can be used for more effectively managing risk and increasing operational resilience. We're going to answer the questions: how do we improve risk management within the existing culture of our organization? What sort of risk culture should our organization be aspiring to in order to enable it to be more successful? And how do we drive change to the existing organizational culture in order to make risk management more relevant and effective? And what does this change involve? We're going to look more specifically at how to measure and evaluate your organization's risk culture. One of the things that we know is that there's been great progress over the past decade on developing, different tools and techniques for managing risk with organizations. And there is that general acceptance that boards need to be mindful of the risks associated with their strategic objectives, including risks that those objectives might be themselves deficient. There's also an appreciation that the risks facing an organization should be addressed in a holistic, integrated, or enterprise risk management approach. And there's various standards and codes, rule books, and approaches that have been developed to help organizations address these issues in a systematic and a comprehensive way. However, we see in business every day that embedding risk management into an organization to the extent that it reliably makes a difference is still a difficult task. And those seeking to do so inevitably come up against the ultimate challenge, which is the people. Human beings acting as individuals and interacting as groups become really our gap in our system, because they don't necessarily behave in the logical, predictable, and controllable way that we'd like them to. We know that every individual brings to the job a unique perception of risk, and every group and organization has its own approach to risk, which is really, in a nutshell, risk culture, which is what we're going to talk about today, that may or may not be helpful in the successful management of risk. So we need to recognize that risk culture is going to influence the mechanisms and techniques that the organization employs to manage risk, but also in turn is going to be influenced by them. We see in ISO 31000, which is the risk management standard, that it refers several times to the need for managing risk to be integrated into the organization's culture, and also for that culture to be well understood as an element of the context for risk management. COSO, in their ERM framework, also recognizes the tone of the organization and how risk is viewed and addressed by its people as part of establishing that internal environment, one of the essential components of enterprise risk management. Rating agencies are also taking a close look at risk culture, with Standard & Poor's stating that a company's risk management culture is the foundation for its enterprise risk management processes, and including culture as a key component in their review methodology. So let's dive in and take a closer look. We're going to start with looking at some definitions, because I know that each of you brings to the table different definitions of maybe how your organization defines these different terms. So I want to just bring to the table how they're going to be discussed today. So first off, the definition of risk that we're using is from ISO 31000, which is very generic. It's that effect of uncertainty on objectives. and understanding that there can be negative events that are threats, and there can be positive events that can be opportunities. So, risk is seen both as a threat and as an opportunity. And then I want to take a quick step back and just look at how organizational culture has been defined. And a common way of saying this is that the people make the place. And as the culture of an organization becomes distinctive, it attracts like-minded people, which is the attraction to work there. And the selection processes increasingly favor those that fit in that organization, or the selection part of it. And the appointees that don't fit they either leave or are fired, which is part of your attrition. And this is really interesting because sometimes you'll see, a lot of times you'll see companies with job openings that have very qualified people not get chosen, and because it's what they've seen is that it isn't a good fit for the organization itself. But also we need to consider that the people, past and present, also make the place. So we have to consider that mixture of influence of its current membership combined with that legacy of the past, which is where we get things like, this is the way we have always done things around here, and those kinds of things, so that your culture is not only defined by its people, but it's defined by its history. I wanted to bring up this picture. It's one of the better pictures that I've seen that talks about enterprise risk management, because I'm going to challenge you on some of these terms, what actually it is that we're talking about. So enterprise risk management has been around for a long time. It's been recognized by a lot of different standards and codes and groups that we just talked about. So the definition for enterprise risk management is really the risks facing an organization should be addressed with a holistic, integrated, or enterprise risk management approach. And various standard codes and rule books and approaches have been developed to help organizations address these issues in a systematic and comprehensive way. So repeating that is we're looking at strategic risk, financial risk, compliance risk, operational risk, and reputational risk, all being combined together as part of that enterprise risk management approach. And so here is where I'm saying that that operational risk is still being part of enterprise risk management. So then moving on to Gartner, when we look at what's operational resilience, then how is enterprise risk management different than operational risk, or how is operational resilience different than enterprise risk management or operational risk? And so Gartner defines, in my opinion, and actually they state it pretty clearly, as initiatives that expand business continuity programs to focus on the impacts. Well, I'll just state out really clearly is ISO 22301 and all the standards that support it all talk about business continuity, and it's focusing on the impacts. It's very clearly stated that business continuity is supposed to focus on the impacts. So I don't see this as expanding business continuity. I see this as what business continuity is. And then connecting risk appetite and tolerance levels for disruption of a product or service. Well, there's a specific clause, and all the way through the standard, they've now taken out, in the 2019 version, they've taken out the term risk appetite and they replaced it with the definition of risk appetite. But risk appetite and risk tolerance levels are very, very clearly part of ISO 22301 and business continuity in its present form. It doesn't need to be expanded. And it's totally tied to the disruption of a product or service delivery and to your internal and external stakeholders. This is the definition of business continuity in a nutshell. And so what I'm questioning here is, how is Gartner's definition of or operational difference any different than what we practice in business continuity? And essentially, they then go on to say that these initiatives coordinate management of risk assessments, risk monitoring, and execution of controls that impact your workforce, your processes, your facilities, your technology, and both physical and cyber security, as well as third parties across the risk domain. And again, this is what we're supposed to be doing in business continuity. In addition, depending on your scope of your business continuity management system, it may include your cyber and physical security. It may include safety, privacy issues, continuity of operations, and reliability. It may not, depends on your scope. So here is where I see these last bullets as being, quote, an expansion of business continuity to operational resilience by broadening that scope. Protivity also defines operational resilience as an organization's ability to detect, prevent, respond to, recover, and learn from operational disruptions that may impact the delivery of important business and economic functions or underlying business services. Seems like business continuity to me. And the key components they define as which they include as defining and understanding important business services and impact tolerance. Well, seems like your business impact analysis might be used there, as well as completing end-to-end mapping, scenario testing, and regular assessments. Again, those are all part of having a business continuity management system. And so here I'm saying, are we coming up with a new term, operational resilience, to replace um, business continuity? Is that the intention? Are we just renaming again? So that really is my question. How is this different from business continuity? So we look at some of the design aspects that Protiviti talks about, and they look at their foundational elements, which is business resilience, cyber resilience, third-party resilience, or your supply chain, and your value chain, as well as your technology resilience. And I'm just going to say business resilience is business continuity. And again, this isn't really much different than a lot of business continuity management systems already in place, with the understanding, okay, if you want to change business continuity to business resilience, you can rename that. And then if you want to expand what the scope is and understanding that you need to be looking at cyber, you need to be looking at your technology, and I'll also argue that third-party resilience is part of business continuity as well as technology. In many organizations, cyber has been kept separate, so that is something that we could discuss. But for the most part, these are part of most organizations' scope for business continuity. Again, another graphic, when they look at what are their categories, cyber, business, third party, and technology. When they look under risk, you're looking at business, security, IT, operational, supplier, and enterprise. I don't see that it is any different than what you're doing for business continuity. And their definition of operational resilience and how you employ that is by formalizing roles and responsibilities, yes. Having an enterprise orchestration, well, of course. Having external communication and sector coordination, of course. You need to have training and awareness. You need to have crisis management tied into that, and you need to have testing and compliance. So my argument here is that the definitions that we're seeing for operational resilience are really no different than what we would see for most business continuity programs if you added the cyber in. So that's my argument for operational resilience. There are many ISO systems that have been identified that manage risk. There's a lot of them, from quality to environmental management, to your IT service management, to food safety, to business continuity, to information security, to your system for your secure supply chain, for managing your facilities, which includes a lot of different aspects, health and safety, energy management, and asset management. So the question then becomes what's the difference between enterprise risk management or operational resilience? So if we look at all the different ways that you can manage risk to the organization, maybe that's a fuller definition for operational resilience than what we're seeing with Gartner and Protiviti. I know those are big names, but I think I'm here to challenge you to be thinking, are we just renaming what we're already doing, or is operational resilience talking about something more? And I don't really care if you call it enterprise risk management or operational resilience, as long as you're including all of these different systems that manage risk, which really leads me to how ICOR defines operational resilience. So we have an organizational resilience model that you see here, which is very clear that we have three dimensions: leadership and strategy, culture and behaviors, and preparedness and managing risk. And each one of these dimensions is a contributing factor to your overall resilience of your organization. So we take this piece, and this would be where we would really define, if you wanted to compare it, where we would look at operational resilience or enterprise risk management. And we recognize that larger body of systems that manage risk than does Gartner or Protiviti. In fact, we've added some that aren't part of ISO. So for example, incident response and crisis management are not yet. They're part of the other systems, but the crisis management standard is still being written. And we also would say that your technology needs to include your data centers themselves and how they're run, your storage and availability, as well as your continuity and recovery. So we're going to be going with the premise here today that this is our definition of operational resilience, that it's much broader than business continuity, and that as a business continuity practitioner and as a risk practitioner, you need to be thinking broader and looking towards this broader definition of operational resilience. Our source document for today is a document that is actually, ironically, subsidized by Protiviti, but it's written by the Institute for Risk Management, and they have put together an entire document on risk culture and how to look at this culture from many different ways. It's over 100 pages long, so I cannot share with you today every part of this, but I do want you to be really aware of the fact that this is a free document that you can download from the Institute for Risk Management's website. And there's a lot of really great things in here, and there's a lot of detail into how to do this that we can't provide in a short presentation like this. But I really liked the quote that to start the document or start the presentation with, is that problems with risk culture are often blamed for organizational difficulties. But until recently, there was very little practical advice around what to do about it. And this became the reason for the creation of this document. So they put together a nice little graphic that's really probably starting from all of the risk culture, all of the cultural things that are recognized, which is that your attitude shapes behavior and your behavior shapes the culture. And your culture then influences your attitude and your culture influences your behavior. So these things are not one-dimensional, they are two-dimensional. So they call it the ABC method. And this could be for any type of culture, not just risk culture. So culture is formed by behavior, which in turn is shaped by attitude. So we define risk attitude as that chosen position adopted by an individual or a group towards risk, and this is influenced by their risk perception. Risk behavior comprises external observable risk-related actions, including risk-based decision-making, risk processes, and risk communications, all of those things that would be a part of a risk assessment process. And then your risk culture then becomes those values, beliefs, knowledge, and understanding about risk that's shared by a group of people with a common purpose. So this is where we're going. This is sort of the scope of what we're going to be talking about today. But we need to recognize that risk culture is impacted by the people in your organization, which is where we started out when we talked about culture, that culture is informed by people. So it's important to understand the effects of the predisposition towards risk and the personal ethics of the people in your organization. So that's where we're going to start, is in this, what we'll call this onion picture, which is that personal predisposition to risk and those personal ethics of the people that run and help to manage your organization. Because each individual brings to the job a unique perception of risk. Each individual's personal disposition to risk also contributes to their ethical stance and how they behave and make decisions. So each group and organization will probably have its own approach to risk or its risk culture that may or not be helpful in the successful management of risk. And this is what really becomes the important piece, is our approach to risk helpful in the management of risk? And risk culture really becomes a product of your organization's overall culture. And so here is where you talk about the individuals, which lead to the behaviors, which leads to your organizational culture, and which helps to define the risk culture. Like with anything else, we have to have a theory. So here is, we have your kind of your normal 4-quadrant theory bucket, I'll call it. And this was actually developed all the way back in 1982, where they had this. So this cultural theory of risk is not new. It is something that's been around for a long time. So we have the fatalists to the left, and the fatalists are really people that are kind of low on the group aspect, but high on the grid aspect. And so they can see little point in an exercise, as any risk system simply impedes them from reacting as circumstances change. So here is where they want to be able to be more responsive to risk and not have to be necessarily part of a group. On the other side of that, the hierarchist is going to want to embed a risk system in the company that defines risk appetite and establishes that risk reward relationship. So really the difference between these two is you've got that fatalist or pragmatist on the left, where they see the future as being inherently uncertain, and therefore strategic planning is not really beneficial. And all you can do is react as circumstances change, versus having risk experts needed to help with assessing how much risk to take on, and whether there is an appropriate reward for balancing that risk. So these are kind of the two sides of that issue. And then the individualist is kind of a low. So they're going to want to consider, they're going to consider that this limits their ability to make profits by engaging in risky ventures. And so this is where these maximizers or the individualists see that risk provides opportunities to secure profits or accrue profits. Therefore, large risks should be accepted if the gains they offer are sufficiently rewarding. And we've seen this in the financial institutions that have perhaps overextended themselves and maybe have too many individualists in their group, and therefore they've engaged in risky ventures that have actually cost the financial institutions a lot of money. We've seen that over and over again through the decades, but most recently is 2008. And finally, we have the egalitarian or the conservators. These are, high group and low grid, and they want to avoid any losses. They believe that's more important than improvising or improving profits. And therefore, it is best to avoid or control or mitigate all risks. So they're going to be very much more what I'd call risk averse. And they believe that they believe that this sanctions risk taking when they would actually prefer a policy of risk avoidance. So you see here that on the right-hand side, you're going to see people more conservative, where they want to have systems in place. They want to make sure that everything's mapped and that you should avoid risk wherever possible. And then you've got on the left-hand side where you want people to be able to respond quickly and be able to engage and take advantage of risk opportunities. And one of the things that's kind of challenging here is that we look at this ability, when I talk about organizational resilience, one of the key attributes is being able to be agile and adaptive and take advantage of opportunities, and to be able to be ahead of change, for example, and not let change manage you. And so here is where you get that kind of fight between managing risk on the one side and being able to be agile and adaptive so that you don't get hunkered down and you get lost. And so this is why it's so important that when we're talking about operational risk, we're looking at operational risk or operational resilience, I should say, excuse me for that. When we're looking at operational resilience, we're looking at that managing risk side of it within the context of also being agile and adaptive. And this presentation today is not talking about organizational resilience, but I felt it's my duty as a spokesperson, as an expert in organizational resilience, to help you understand that operational resilience is a lot about managing risk. And a lot of times if you're managing risk as a hierarchist and as an egalitarian, that you might be having a much more conservative approach, and that might be impacting then how you deal with managing change within the organization. So I'm not advocating that any one of these categories is correct. I'm just saying we need to be aware of them and how they influence our decision making. So this is pretty much the base document that the Institute for Risk Management uses to talk about risk culture. And so we're going to be talking today about these four areas: tone at the top, governance, decisions, and competency. And these become their key indicators. And this was developed in 2010. So this is something that hopefully you've seen before. So one of the things that we look at, if the color is blue, we're talking about having a greater impact on sociability, which is an aspect of risk culture. And if we're talking about more the purple or the hot pink, we're talking greater impact on solidarity. And you need both sociability, which means how you communicate, how information is shared at your organization, to be part of this process, as well as solidarity, which is that means that you're all moving in the same direction. So let's look a little bit more at each one of these. So risk leadership is looking at the fact that senior management needs to set clear and consistent expectations for managing risk, and that leaders role model risk management thinking and actively discuss risk tolerance to risk issue, or actually discuss that tolerance itself to different risk issues. So they need to be leading with that tone from the top. They also need to have a way to deal with bad news. So how do you respond to bad news? So in this place, senior management should actively seek out information about risk events, and they need to reward those who are open and honest about risk. So when somebody comes to you and says that they've identified either something that they've stopped from happening, or that they've identified a potential issue that could turn into a risk, that those people are heard and listened to. And sometimes that's the reward enough. When we look at governance, we're first looking at accountability. So management needs to be clear about their accountability for managing business risk. So who's responsible for doing that? And that means that you need to have role descriptions and targets that include risk accountabilities. And we'll talk more about each one of these things. And you also need to have transparency, and that kind of goes back to that communication piece, where you need to have timely communication about your risk information across the organization, and that risk events are seen as an opportunity to learn. Next, when we look at decisions, we need to make informed decisions. So leaders need to seek out risk information in order to support their decisions. And there needs to be the business willingness to take on risks needs to be understood and communicated. And one of the things I'm going to just mention here, but we'll talk about more, is that risk, there might be different risk cultures in different parts of your organization, just like there's going to be different risk tolerance and different risk appetites in different parts of your organization, depending on what they do. And then looking at that reward. So looking at performance management being linked to decision making, and that leaders are supportive of those actively seeking to understand and manage risks. And finally, we're going to look at competency. So you need to have risk resources. So the risk function has a defined remit. What are they supposed to be doing? And they have a defined amount of resources, which then means they have the support of its leaders. And they also need to be able to challenge that their risks are managed, which means you need to have the resources in place to fully investigate what you're being told. Yeah, we're okay, we're good, we got it all under control. Do they really? So you need to make sure you have resources available to do that. And all this plays a part in your risk culture. And finally, you need to have risk skills. So you need to have a structure of risk champions that support whoever's managing those risks. And of course, you need to have training programs in place for your people. So let's go back to the individual again and look at that predisposition to risk, because that's where we're going to be focusing, because your people make up your company. They make up who you are. So the question becomes for you that I would raise if I was in front of you in person and I'd have you raise your hands. Are you spontaneous and do you challenge convention? Or are you more organized, systematic, and compliant? If you had to pick which one of those, you'll say, oh, I'm both. But if you had to pick which one of those are you? And there's not a correct answer here. You need to be, we need people that are both of these. And then again, are you cautious, pessimistic, and anxious? Or are you optimistic, resilient, and fearless? And I don't really like to see the word resilient in here. There's actually a really great article in the Newsweek that was published in the beginning of September about the science of resilience. And I'm going to actually be doing a webinar on that later this month, but that talks about resilient people. And so this idea that people that are optimistic tend to be more resilient and tend to be more fearless. But, those are definite attributes of particular people. So the question becomes, with regard to risk taking, individual differences are deeply anchored in our personalities. Each one of us is born a particular way. And I'm sure you've seen, if you have children, that, right out of the box, you've got a kid crawling out of the crib and the other one's just sitting there waiting for you to come pick them up. We have different personalities when we're born, but we also have ways that we can learn. And so, Just because you have a certain personality doesn't make your every act precisely predictable. But identifying the risk types and the people that work for you is really important because it has a persistent influence in how people behave and their predisposition for risk. And so we're going to be talking next about risk type. So this is what they're calling a risk type compass, and this is an IRM tool. And essentially what they do is it places individuals in one of 8 risk categories or risk types, which range in levels of risk tolerance. And then they believe this has that fundamental influence in the way an individual is likely to perceive and handle risk and make decisions. So to me, this would be a really important thing for you to have as an assessment tool, maybe not this particular tool, but to have an assessment tool for evaluating a person's predisposition to risk when you're doing the hiring or when you're doing job placements, or even if you're going to be doing training. Who do we need to focus on? So you'll see the top 3 quadrants are people that have a low disposition to risk. The bottom 3 quadrants have a high disposition to risk. And of course, in the middle, we have the more typical or average. So let's take a closer look at each one of these. So if you're wary, you're going to be self-disciplined, cautious, uneasy, and conservative. You might be ultra sensitive about the vulnerability to risk, and you might be zealous and fervently seek to control. And this is probably someone you want to have managing your money, for example. This is somebody that you want to have um, looking at as part of an audit process. And so, these traits are also really important, and people tend to seek out jobs where that match their predisposition to risk as well. So prudent is somebody who might be more detailed and organized, very systematic and conscientious, that their primary concern is to bring order to everything and to eliminate risk and uncertainty. We know we can't eliminate risk, but that's what they would like. Kind of on the average side, on the deliberate, you might be analytical, investigative, calm, and businesslike. You might be described as calculated and sure-footed. And you test the ground and you don't go into anything unprepared. And I can see business continuity people kind of fitting into this category. So as we're going through this, think about which one of these traits and characteristics might describe you. Then we're moving more to the high range of risk, and you've got somebody composed. You'll see cool-headed, self-contained, imperturbable. I'm not even sure if I said that right. These are people strangers to anxiety, and they might be considered oblivious to risk. They often are able to keep their heads when others lose theirs. And one of the things that we know with more resilient people is that you can become more composed as you have more experience managing risk. And as you've gone through difficult times, you're more likely to become composed. Where if you're going through a really difficult time for the first time, you're less likely to be composed because you don't have the experience of surviving it. And so just remember that these are not things that don't change, but these are kind of a measure for the moment. Somebody at the very opposite of the wary person is the adventurous. This is someone uninhibited, fearless, challenging, adventuresome. They're both fearless and impulsive. I saw something that my sister posted on Facebook yesterday. I don't know why I was looking at this, but I was. And she posted that somebody had built, like they had this shelf that was just, I don't want to say cloth, but it made out of fabric. They were anchored to a cliff like 1,000 feet above ground, just anchored there, and they were just sitting there and they were going to sleep there for the night. And I'm just saying that was probably somebody who's very adventurous, who's fearless and impulsive, and they're going to try things that no one else has ever tried. I would put those people in that boat. And I don't know if I'd want those people necessarily running my company's risk department, but I might want them in my marketing and in research and development area. So someone carefree is more highly dispositioned to risk, but they might be seen as more versus composed. They might be seen more as carefree. They're easygoing. They like to seek excitement. They might be unconventional and impetuous. They relish the excitement of on-the-fly decision making required in fast-moving situations. Spontaneous is the opposite side of the deliberate average. This is someone who might be excitable and unpredictable, enthusiastic and impulsive. They're attracted by the idea of spontaneity and risk, but sometimes they live to regret decisions made in haste. And then finally, we have the, again, more low disposition to risk, someone who's intense. They might be considered ardent, a little more anxious and edgy, as well as passionate. They invest passionately in people and projects, but sometimes they can be haunted by the fear of not being successful or being disappointed. So these are the categories and that the Institute for Risk Management has put together to really help identify the different risk types that an organization has with its people. We're back to those individuals. So here's kind of an outcome of doing a risk type assessment. So on the left, what in this company, what you're seeing is they have kind of a balance between their weary and their adventurous. So the bigger the circle, the kind of the more people are there. And then you see that they also have, um, an intense and spontaneous group. So they don't really have anybody on the right-hand side, that prudent, deliberate, or composed. The other thing that you can do is just make a simple chart. So for example, in the upper right-hand corner, we see that as you move from very low risk comfort zone to very high risk comfort zone, you would expect your internal audit to be in the low range, and you might expect your marketing and public relations people to be in the high range, with your HR people, your board and executive team being sort of in the middle. So one of the things you'll want to do is look at your different demographic factors as well, to be looking at, what are the qualifications of the people? How long have the people been with the company, or other different sociometric data that might be influencing this? So for example, if you've got an executive team that's been around for a long time, I'll just say that because it doesn't happen very often. They've got experience handling things, they might be willing to take more risk than somebody that's newer to the job. So those things impact us as well. This is an example of how you would look at risk type perspective from different departments. So this is using that same risk type compass way to give the same results as what we just saw with that other more of a bench or a line chart. So here you can see that your board and executive team tend to be a little bit more risk tolerant, willing to go out and take some risks. They're more carefree, adventurous, and composed. Where internal audit, you're seeing much more at the top, with the I can't even see that word. Sorry, the intense, the wary, and the prudent. And then you've got your marketing and your PR people, again, much more risk taking, and your HR people kind of scattered all over the board, which actually makes some sense that HR would be more balanced across these things. So let's take a look next about what does good risk culture look like. So one of the things that we talk about is you should be having people that will challenge your existing assumptions and forecasts, both internally and externally. Don't just take for granted what someone is telling you. Where this is a topic that cognitive bias, that is something that every company should be looking at as part of their diversity inclusion. The cognitive bias piece is very important with making sure that you're not making decisions based on the fact that you're not very diverse. So be aware that cognitive bias exists, and as you're accepting information, be careful that you don't have cognitive bias actually informing those decisions. And so you also need to make sure that you're cultivating cognitive dissonance, which is kind of the opposite. So you need to know, who are the no's? What kind of information is disturbing others, but maybe they're not saying it? So when we talk about risk culture, we need to have a culture that allows you as a person in your company to share when you disagree with something or that you want to question something. So here is where we're getting to having some kind of a culture that allows you to question, allows you to disagree. And then, does your organization communicate all aspects of risk in a balanced and ethical decision making? And do you do that regularly and relentlessly? Is this something that's part of what you do? Do you continually refine your risk management processes? We know that with every management system, we talk about continuous improvement. And so no matter what you have in place today, you need to make it better tomorrow. So how do you go about doing that? We're talking again about that whole cognitive bias and cognitive dissonance here. Be careful that you're not doing groupthink. So there's a reason why we talk about this a lot is because risk culture is trying to avoid those things. Making sure that you have a wide range of internal risk and ethics ambassadors with clear reporting lines to the board. You know, risk should not be just owned by a small group of people. You need to have those ambassadors placed all through your organization that are part of that reporting and communication with the board as well. And then make sure that you have senior non-executive directors to monitor all suspicious feedback. You should also carry out external audits on risk and ethics culture. They say every 6 months. I don't care about the time frame so much as that as long as it's done regularly. And you need to encourage some risk taking, knowing that sometimes it will go wrong and it may cost you money. You can't live without taking some risk. And of course, have a continuous learning attitude. I don't want to walk away from this without talking about how important international culture is. So we have an entire course, and it's part of our organizational resilience series where we talk about the impact of international cultures. And so the question in the United States is we don't really do anything unless it's the law. We don't care about international standards. Is it the law? Are we required? Or in Asia and the Arabian Gulf, we're talking more about relationships. And in Europe, you know, stereotype is that is it logical? So the question is, this was a statement that was made by Lord Brown, who was then the executive at BP, who was reputed to have told his internal auditors that the philosophy for their internal controls was, we don't like surprises. Well, in the UK, that meant you need to alert your superiors to any looming problems. In the UK, this meant, in the United States, this meant nasty surprises are to be hidden, totally looking at this from a different viewpoint. And so it's really important that you understand culture and you understand how to communicate in different countries so that people are hearing what you're saying. So when you're evaluating organizational culture, these are some things that you need to consider. Are there identifiable stories and values that are commonly referenced and shared within the organization? If so, what do they say about your culture? And here's where we're really looking at organizational culture at the front end here. Is there a common theme to organization artifacts found within those communal places of the organization? Is there a strong set of published values that are regularly referenced, taught to new joiners, and reinforced by management? And what do those values say about the culture of the organization? I can tell you young people today are looking at those and deciding if they want to work for a company based on their values. Is there a common set of terms or accepted language that's frequently used within the organization over and above the terminology common to the actual sector that they operate in as it pertains to culture? And is expertise respected alongside seniority? And then some key questions for the board. How have we, as a board, fully articulated the risk appetite of the organization such that the culture of the organization can deliver effectively? Do we have a blame culture operating? This is something you do not want to have. Does the organization structure support or detract from the development of an organization-wide sociability aspect, how you communicate? Do we really acknowledge and live the values we publish at every level in everything that we do? Do we have multiple subcultures within the organization, and do they support social exchange, or are they subcultural barriers to our cultural development? And a communal culture requires time and investment. Do we as a board invest consistently and wisely to both develop and maintain an effective communal culture? So one of the things that they've done here is, and this is kind of a snapshot into potential sources of failure and looking at some risk culture traits such as attitude. So the denial of current organizational issues or risks, having overconfidence and a lack of open decision-making process. When you're looking at response, having a detachment and slow response can be a source of risk culture failures. You can certainly look at examples in your company and how they have reacted to COVID and all the changes that COVID has brought on, the ups and the downs and all of the ins and the outs. We're back to work, we're not back to work, what are we doing? Respect, the level of effectiveness of the risk function itself, as well as the respect for risk is influenced by that perceived value added to the risk management process. So what's the value of risk management in your organization? And then looking at transparency and alignment. What are the ambiguities and lack of insight of issues, and how do they promote the risk culture failures and unwanted behaviors? So being able to try to avoid those ambiguities and lack of insight. So when we're looking at escalation and reporting, a fundamental test of any organization's risk culture is the extent to which it is able to internalize and learn from risk events that have occurred, and what is discussed should be addressed. And so what management focuses on that can then be improved. On the other hand, what's hidden or only whispered about can cause serious damage. Organizations can only learn lessons from failure if they have robust internal processes and ensure that the reporting of problems occurs at the earliest opportunity. A clear measure of tone at the top is whether management conveys the message that it is worse to delay communication of a difficult issue, or whether in reality executives do not really want to hear that bad news. So, we want people to be communicating as early as possible. And really an essential aspect of creating a risk-aware culture is one where open discussion of what could and what has gone wrong is encouraged, because only in such an environment can the reoccurrence of such events be prevented. Ideally, your near miss events should be identified and analyzed right away in order to prevent unexpected losses. And you should have strong procedures and processes that require you to do this. The primary purpose of this is really to capture and share learning from unexpected or unintended events. Reporting of these events should be non-threatening, with no blame attached to those highlighting the occurrence of an event. And then communicating the purpose. Why are we doing this? Why are we trying to talk about this? What does it mean for the organization? And again, reminding people that they will not be penalized or victimized for reporting events in much the same way as whistleblowing process needs to be very carefully positioned and explained. Of course, you need to always improve your risk event reporting as well, making sure that making risks themselves as visible as possible. And this really results in your people being part of managing risk and helping them to discuss the risks associated with their departmental objectives and whether appropriate actions are to be taken. And then really this goes back to this whole overarching aim by making the process more tangible. So rather than discussing what could happen, it's also possible to review what has happened to that part of the organization or other departments, and then to seek, of course, to learn from those experiences. Because the real failure is to allow the same event to occur twice within an organization without seeking to prevent it. And how can how can organizations truly encourage managers to demonstrate the courage of sharing with their peers what has gone wrong? And that's why you need to have some kind of a reward system in place, or even if it's just thank you, thank you for doing this, and recognizing them is a reward. So I want to tie this next to performance management. To what extent does your performance management process encourage or discourage appropriate risk-taking behaviors? And I'm using that word appropriate because this is important, and it's going to depend on what part of the organization you work in. So you need to have risk-aware objective setting. So the management of risk needs to be clearly and visibly linked to your strategic and business planning process. And you need to align the personal objectives with those organizational goals. They need to understand how each person in the organization helps to manage risk. You need to have risk-linked objectives. So where managers have been defined as risk owners and have accountability for managing controlling specific risk exposure, this responsibility should be reflected in your objectives. And you would think it all should be reflected in your job description. You should also incorporate a risk competency. So what do people really need to know if they're part of managing risk in your organization? What is it that you're trying to do? So, is an ability to demonstrate a strong awareness of risk, how risk aggregates, and how to communicate uncertainty effectively and incorporate risk into management decision making. This is an example of what they're suggesting that you might want to do. Which then gets us back to kind of 10 elements of an effective risk culture, kind of to summarize what we're talking about. You need to focus on dynamics as well as the mechanics. You need to consciously manage that risk culture. You need to monitor the tone at all levels. It isn't just about tone at the top. You need to be looking at middle and bottom as well. You need to make sure that people are trained to know what they're looking for and to look for behavioral bias and all of those things that we just talked about. Also, making sure that you're aligning the management of your risk culture with your wider initiatives that involve employee engagement and people strategy. You need to provide training and support for managers and leaders so that they can then have a bigger impact on the people that they work with. And remember, again, don't shoot the messenger. We need to strengthen the hand of those whose job it is to police the system versus shooting them. And also look at how you can underpin your culture with appropriate incentive and reward systems and get rid of ones that are inappropriate. Of course, you need to engage your board and executive management jointly in agreeing on your risk appetite, so that making sure that the risk appetite is understood at all levels of decision making in the organization and that the implications of the risk appetite on the decisions being made are fully understood. And recognize that rules and regulations can only go so far. We've seen that over and over again with different institutions that have gone within those rules and regulations to do things that they shouldn't. So just kind of to conclude, we need to build the right risk culture. And the cultures that drive long-term value for customers and shareholders are those that are effective at managing risk. Sometimes companies express a concern that establishing an effective risk culture means suppressing the dynamic entrepreneurial nature of the business. And really the reverse is true. It kind of gets back to what I was talking about, you know, being agile and adaptive, which is part of being a more resilient organization, and then managing risk on the other side. Remember, there's opportunity risk as well. And so the challenges that banks and some insurers have faced over the past few years have really demonstrated that a failure to manage culture can destroy your value on an enormous scale. So managing risk sells, and having the right risk culture is going to help you um, long term with the value of your organization. So just to summarize, the bottom line for leaders is that if they do not become conscious of the cultures in which they are embedded, those cultures will manage them. And cultural understanding is desirable for all of us, but it's essential to leaders if they are to lead. And this is, from the expert Edward Schein, who's been recognized as the authority on organizational culture and leadership. And there's nothing that is stated with organizational culture that can't be attributed to risk culture. I have given you the references, so I would strongly recommend that you take a look and read this document from the Institute of Risk Management on risk culture, and take a look at both Gartner's and Protiviti's on how they look at operational resilience and see how that works for your organization as well. We have 2 webinars left for this year. November 17th, Minimizing Risk to Global Value Chains. We'll probably talk a little bit about supply chain as well, just because that is in the news, as well as December 15th, How Culture Shapes Behavior to Build a More Resilient Organization. Our 2022 webinar schedule should be coming out shortly. And as a reminder, we're really excited to announce our Organizational Resilience Capability Assessment. If you are interested in gaining recognition for the capabilities that your organization has on organizational resilience, this is a great opportunity for you. And of course, contact ICOR to learn more, take a look at our newsletter, and please follow us on our group and our company page. Thank you very much. So we actually do have some time for questions today. Just as a reminder, the presentation itself will be available in a day or two on our website. And there's a lot more information in that paper from IRM that you might want to look at. And especially if you want to really build on what we've shared here, there's a lot of great content. Any other questions that we have? I hardly ever am done early, so this is an unusual opportunity. Well, if you have no questions, thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next month. And by the way, if you do have any ideas or suggestions on what you'd like us to speak on or to learn more about, please let us know. And we did have one question that was interesting here. So just if you have any ideas for future webinars, please send them my way. And I can see if it's something that I can do or I can get someone else to do. It says, what are some trade-offs if both the first and second line of defense are integrated due to resource constraints? Well, this is probably a pretty common set of circumstances, and I actually don't really have a great answer for that. I'm sorry, but if anyone else does, feel free to share that. That's the danger of asking questions on the live screen, as I may not have your answer right away. But let me think about it too, and if I can find anything, I'll let you know. But I do think it's a common problem that a lot of organizations have. Another comment is I often encounter risk culture roadblocks because they do not assign risk management in a C-level. Yeah, only the middle manager level. This is a key problem and very, very good observation. Thank you for sharing that. Maybe even just sharing, some of this information from the IRM paper with management to say, and if you can tie some of the failures that the organization's had or near misses that the organization has had, if you can tie it to anything about risk culture, that might be something that will help you to demonstrate the value of that. Yeah, I don't, risk management's been around forever, and and we still don't see the assignment of that at the C-level. We still, even with enterprise risk management being around for so long, it's surprising to me that every company doesn't have that. And somebody else said that they're struggling with the same issue as well. One of the other questions is, how is risk culture integrated or embedded in the ISO 31000 framework? Here's where I would say I don't know that it is. ISO 31000 is taking a higher level view at this, where I think that everybody talks about the fact that the culture of your organization and your leadership organization will impact how you manage risk. But I also think and surprisingly, I wasn't able to find anything else besides IRM's piece on risk culture as well. So while I found it a really fascinating topic and something that kind of explains a lot of failures, I was surprised to see not more information about it from other organizations and other papers that are documented. So this is something that I'm going to look at more. And we are working on kind of a strategy document that will support ISO 22316 on organizational resilience. So I'm already starting to think about how we can incorporate risk culture into that document too. So that might help us to do some more exploration of this. The question is organizational risk only from the UK? I learned of it through the Bank of England, but now learning more about it now. I think these are just different terms. So I mean, enterprise risk management and organizational risk seem to me to be the same thing. And it's when you kind of move from the managing risk side on the resilience side is where I see, moving into that more agile and adaptive piece and looking at how you can strengthen your organization instead of just responding to risks or mitigating risks. So I'm not familiar with the term organizational risk specifically, so it might be something that's more local. What's just concerning to me is really where we started out with this presentation, which is, everybody coming up with different words for the same thing. I think ICOR's been around since 2005 and identified and defined organizational resilience. ISO 22316 on organizational resilience defined it as well, and so we've adopted their definition. And it still really surprises me how people are still using organizational resilience to me not more than managing risk either. So that's been the fight that I feel like I've been having um, with just trying to get people to talk about operational resilience and the role it plays in organizational resilience. So I think these are still, I don't want to call them battles to come, but I think that we all need to be aware of kind of the trends to just rename things. And if you're going to be if business continuity is going to be renamed operational resilience, then how does business continuity need to change? And how does business continuity then expand? Because business continuity is an important part of it, but it isn't the whole thing. And so that's why even though I usually have a lot of respect for what Gartner and Protiviti does, and I reference them all the time, Their definitions of operational resilience had me scratching my head because they are leaders and they do influence a lot of people. And, I think that we need to give business continuity the respect it deserves as well by fully understanding that all of the things that it does and all the different ways it manages risk and not just changing the name to say. So again, is business continuity and organizational resilience the same? No. Organization business continuity is just what we say is like 1/20th or 1/25th of different ways to manage risk. There's tons of ways to manage risk in your organization. And that is just one piece of organizational resilience, as you saw in our model at the very beginning. So, take a look at our website and look at our different models so that you can see how we have really looked at managing risk as being one aspect of organizational resilience. And especially when you look at our capability assessment, you'll see that as well, which is tied to our competencies or what leaders need to know if they're going to lead in resilience efforts. They definitely need to know that more than business continuity. And when you look at the actual organizational resilience model itself, which is much simpler, and it's just one of those three aspects. So thank you very much for your time today. We look forward to seeing you next month, and have a great week.